Yo, what's going on everybody, this is Roggen here. Welcome to my top 5 tips for editing gaming montages. In this video I'm going to go over the top 5 editing mistakes that I see in gaming montages all over YouTube, and I'm going to show you how to fix them to improve your gaming montages and edits. I'm going to be using Valorant clips in this video, but it applies to any FPS game, so bear that in mind and just apply it to whichever clips you're using. I'm going to be showing these in Adobe After Effects, but it applies to literally any software. The editing software you're using is not important, this is more about the concept and the method of doing it. So regardless of which software you're using, this video will apply to you. If you do want After Effects or Premiere Pro, then I'll leave a link in the description to where you can get them. If you look down at the video's progress bar right now, you'll see the video's been split into chapters, so you can navigate through and check out each tip individually. Although I do recommend sticking all the way through to the end of the video, as I think all these tips are very useful. Without any further ado, let's get into the first one. But the first tip I have for you is to fix the crosshair in your gameplay footage, particularly when it comes to adding motion blur. I see this all the time in pretty much every montage I see where the editors use some form of motion blur, typically RSMB. I will be showing it using RSMB, but it applies to any kind of motion blur. And that is when you have the flickery blurred crosshair in the middle of the screen and it's really quite distracting. I'll put the example on screen of what I'm talking about right now. So if you watch the crosshair here, you'll notice it doing a lot of flickering with the motion blur, especially during fast movements. So you'll see here particularly, if I rewind it to this particular spot in the clip, right here on this background, you see where it's doing all of this? I'm going to show you how to make it go from that to this. And you'll see here now, if I play through this clip, the crosshair is completely fixed, while the motion blur is still applied to the rest of the clip. Now the first thing you're going to want to do to try and fix this is to make a mask around the crosshair. This is only the first method and will only work in certain cases, and I will show you both ways of how to do it, but to start with I'll just show you with the mask. And essentially what you're going to want to do is go on your adjustment layer if you have your motion blur applied to an adjustment layer, in which case you can see I have here my adjustment layer has RSMB applied to it. If you can't apply it to an adjustment layer or you've applied it to your standard clip, then just duplicate the clip with the motion blur applied to it, remove the motion blur from one of the clips, and then whichever clip's on top apply the mask to and either add or subtract depending on which layer your clips are in. So the idea is to have the motion blur applied to everything but the crosshair, and I'll show you what I mean. So in my case I can use an adjustment layer. If I come up to the pen tool in Adobe After Effects, every software is going to be different, but they will all have a masking feature of sorts. And you see if I just use down here as an example where this sage is lying on the ground, you can see there is blur applied there. If I mask around it just like this, you see the motion blur is only applied to inside the mask and not anywhere else in the clip. If I come down to my mask over here, you can see I've got it using the add mode. If I change it to subtract, you'll see the motion blur is everywhere except for in this mask, and that's essentially all I've done for the crosshair up here. So if I delete this mask, you can see if I zoom in that the crosshair just has a simple mask around it just like this. I go to a point in time where the crosshair flickering is a bit more obvious, like here for example. And now if I set my mask to the subtract mode, you'll see the crosshair is now completely clear. There is an issue here that I run into, which is the fact that the flickering crosshair can still be seen behind it. In order to remove that, we just need to expand our mask a bit. So if I increase the mask expansion, which is basically just going to make the mask bigger, to something like say 15 pixels, the blurriness from behind it is gone. Now this does come with one downside, where if I go to a point in time where it's more obvious, like here, you can see where the mask is expanded and it doesn't exactly blend in very well. That's where the mask feather option comes in. Again, any software that has the option to mask will have a feather option. I'm just going to set it to about 20 pixels and you'll see it's way less obvious now. And you can mess around with the mask expansion and feather to get the best effect you can. You just essentially just want to make sure that the flickering crosshair behind it isn't visible. And all this is doing essentially is taking the layer that I have the motion blur applied to and just cutting a hole in it so it doesn't take into account this portion. Now the problem with doing it this way is you can see it is still kind of obvious, and depending on the scenario you may not be able to get away with it. And the reason it's like this is because the motion blur being on the adjustment layer, or if you apply it to the layer directly, it is still calculating the motion blur as if the crosshair is there. And that's the reason why we get this flickering crosshair behind an otherwise perfect crosshair. Now I'm going to show you what my second method is and the one that I recommend to be able to hide this completely, although it is a little bit more difficult. So if I just remove this mask completely, we don't need to worry about that anymore. What you're going to want to do is disable the motion blur, go to the clip without the motion blur, and you're going to want to mask out your crosshair again just like this. So use the pen tool or whatever the tool is in your software and just click around to mask it out. And then if I set this mask to subtract, you'll see it removes the crosshair completely. Now in After Effects there's a feature called Content Aware Fill. So if I go up to Window, Content Aware Fill, down here you'll see the panel for it. Using this tool, After Effects is able to estimate what would be here behind this mask. So in this case it will just copy the brick texture across, and then it will produce this PNG sequence which will essentially just fill in where the mask is cut out. So if you click on image like 447 for example, you'll see this is where we've masked out and it's copied that brick texture from behind. If we now overlay this PNG sequence onto our clips, just like this, you'll see it's now completely hidden our crosshair entirely, as if it was never there. And that way, when we apply the RSMB to it, there will be no flickery crosshair because it was never there to begin with. Now, this is the best way to do it in my opinion, although it is a little bit more tedious. If you're going to use flow frames, like I mentioned in my previous smooth video tutorial, then you should export your clip like this before putting it into flow frames, so there is no crosshair, and then we will just add it back afterwards. That way the AI doesn't get confused about the crosshair. Now, a problem with this that I'm sure people will point out, if we disable the motion blur and we go back through our clip, we'll notice that if we look where the crosshair should be, it'll be completely invisible most of the time, but in certain scenarios, like here for example, you can see it hasn't done a very good job at being able to hide it. Now, this won't matter for the RSMB. You see, if we enable the RSMB, it's pretty much invisible, and we're going to have a crosshair over that anyway. This fill layer is purely to stop the flickering crosshair behind our normal crosshair. So if I disable the RSMB again, so we can just see our normal clip, and then we duplicate our clip, move it above the fill layer, and change our mask from subtract to add, we'll put our crosshair right back on. And now if we play through the clip, there should be literally no difference at all to how our clip was before we removed the crosshair. Now, the cool thing about this, if we disable the crosshair and disable our fill layer, so we have our original crosshair, re-enable our motion blur, and then go to a point in the video where it was particularly bad last time. So for example here, this squiggle was supposed to be our crosshair. If we apply our fill layer above our main clip, but make sure it's below our motion blur clip, just like this, you'll see the crosshair disappears entirely, and throughout the whole video the crosshair is gone. And we enable our masked out crosshair layer, just like this, and you'll see it's not really done anything, and that's because it's below our motion blur layer. So if we drag it above that, you'll see now our crosshair's back. And now through using our fill layer, we can remove the background flickered crosshair like that. So if we take our fill layer and enable it, it's gone. Now, the reason for that is because our motion blur is only going to be blurring what's below the adjustment layer that it's applied to. So what the motion blur is seeing is this. So there's no crosshair there for it to blur and make flickery. And now if we just scroll through our video, you'll see the crosshair is completely fine in every single scenario. Even here where it would be blurred before, it's completely fine. And this is something that I wish people would just spend a little bit more time doing, because it's really annoying seeing a flickering crosshair throughout the whole montage, and I know a lot of people can agree with me. I've got comments on it before. So shout out to Mana, I believe I'm saying that name right, probably not, but shout out to you for pointing this out on my previous motion blur video. And that's it for editing tip and mistake number 1. Just before we move on to tip 2, I just want to mention that a lot of you guys watch my videos but you're not actually subscribed. So if that is you and you're not subscribed, scroll down, hit the subscribe button, leave a like while you're at it, as well as comment any other video tutorial ideas you'd like to see on the channel, as well as check out my Patreon where you can get cool bonuses like project files from my tutorials and edits, as well as access to my videos early. I'm going to be posting a setup tour as my 50k special video in the coming days. However, that's already live on my Patreon right now if you wish to go and check that out early. And now let's move on to tip number 2. Now, my second tip and mistake that I see happen a lot and doesn't really get talked about is exporting and re-importing clips. Now, editors do this loads when they're switching from software to software. Say you want to do one effect in one software, switch back to another one. So in my case, I want to do my intense effects in After Effects, but I want to edit the whole thing itself in Adobe Premiere Pro. People render it out of one software, import it into another one, render it out of there, import it into another one, render it out of there, and then upload to YouTube where it gets compressed. All this re-rendering, re-exporting, and compression destroys a video's quality. From when a video is recorded, it should only be exported and rendered once out of one software and then go through YouTube's compression. Otherwise, the quality just gets destroyed, and no one wants that for their montage. Now, there are a few ways to mitigate this. So the first one is Adobe specific, so I'm going to talk about that first, and then the second way applies to any software. So with Adobe, for example, say I'm editing this clip in Premiere Pro, which I am right now, and I decide here I want to add an effect, but it's going to be easier for me to do in After Effects, or it's just simply not possible in Premiere Pro. So I'm going to cut my clip to be the part where I want to add the effect in After Effects. And you'll see there's this segment here. This is where I want to add my effect, for example. And then I'm going to right click on it. And now instead of taking this clip, exporting it, and then importing it back into After Effects, I'm going to right click on it and come up to the option where it says replace with After Effects composition. Now what that's going to do is open up After Effects, and what that's going to do is automatically create a project, which you can see here I can save. So if I save this, I'll name it Premiere Pro to After Effects project, and save that. The exact clip that I was editing in Premiere Pro, this part right here, which you'll see has now turned pink because it is an After Effects composition, has been imported into my After Effects, and I can add whatever effects I want to right here. So let's say I want to add, I don't know, optics compensation to this clip, which is an effect that is not available, in Premiere Pro. You have to use lens distortion instead, but that's besides the point. In After Effects, I want to add optics compensation, so I'm going to drag and drop that on my clip, do whatever I want with it. So I'm going to reverse the lens distortion and do something like this, just to show you how it works. Then I'm also going to add the Find Edges effect, which is available in Premiere Pro, but that doesn't really matter. I'm going to invert it, and there we go. So I've made my effect in here. I'm going to save my After Effects project, exit out, and you'll see inside of Premiere Pro, the composition down here has updated, and in my timeline, I now have the effects from Adobe After Effects. Now, the downside to this is, depending on your PC specs, you may struggle to do this, in which case you'll want to follow the second method, which applies to any software, but still works with Adobe. You'll see I do only have Premiere Pro open in my taskbar, but if I open my task manager, because I have an After Effects comp open inside of Premiere Pro, I do also have Adobe After Effects open in the background. So depending on your PC specs, you may or may not be able to do this, but this is the best way to do it to avoid re-encoding video and losing quality. Now, another quick thing worth mentioning is you can do this the other way around from After Effects to Premiere Pro. So say I've edited this composition in After Effects and I now want to import it into Premiere Pro, as in it wasn't there to begin with, which you can see it is not included in my Premiere Pro project already. I can simply just drag and drop it into Premiere Pro. So you'll see at the top, After Effects project is called Tips Test. I open up Premiere Pro, open up my file explorer, and I find Tips Test, the After Effects project file, drag and drop that into my Premiere Pro. It will open up this window, and you can see I've got the composition called Edit for Premiere, which is right here, which is the composition that I'm in here. I'll click that composition, hit OK, and it will import the file. And if I add that to my timeline right here, you'll see the composition from inside of After Effects is now inside of Premiere Pro, just like it is in here. And any changes that I make here will be reflected in Premiere Pro. You can also do the same thing with other Adobe file formats like Photoshop PSD files, for example. You can just drag and drop them straight into either software, and I believe it works for Adobe Audition as well. Now, for the second method, which applies to any other editing software, you're going to want to export the clip that you've edited to be imported into another software using an uncompressed or lossless video codec and format. So I'll show you what I mean. So let's say I'm done editing this clip here and I want to export it to then re-import it into another software, whether that's Davinci Resolve or Sony Vegas or any other video editing software. A common reason for this is I know Davinci Resolve has incredible color tools for color correcting, color grading, and color matching. So I know a lot of people will export their clips to import into Davinci Resolve for that purpose, and this is the best way to do so without losing quality. So let's say I'm done with editing this clip. I'm going to come over to export, and over on the left hand side you'll see I'm using the H.264 format, which in this case is going to be an MP4 file. Now, H.264 uses lossy compression, meaning every time you render using this format, the quality of your video is going to reduce. Regardless of whether you keep the same settings every time, the quality will get worse. I'll put on screen right now what I mean. The one frame is the video that's been exported once, and the second is the same video but been exported, re-imported, and exported a few times. You'll see that there is a significant quality decrease. Now, to avoid this, we can use a lossless or uncompressed format. So under the format options, you'll see AVI and AVI uncompressed are the two that I would typically use. Otherwise, you have other options like PNG, so you can export a PNG sequence if your clip doesn't have audio, or you can export it as a PNG sequence, then export the video as you normally would, but I assume in a lower resolution because all you're going to care about is the audio, and then import the PNG sequence to keep the quality video, and then import the lower quality video but with audio below that. That way you maintain the best of both worlds, because you get smaller file sizes from PNG because PNGs are actually compressed, but they just use lossless compression. In this case, I'm going to come up to AVI uncompressed, and the downside to using this is, and why I would recommend dynamic link if you can use it, is because it drastically increases file size. So I'm going to quickly name this export, and you'll see the quality of the video over here is really poor, and that's because the frame size has just been set wrong. So my clip was recorded at 2560 by 1440, so I'm just going to select that. Keep the quality at 100. Obviously, if you reduce this and export it, then the quality will be reduced. The idea is to keep it at 100 to preserve 100% of the detail from the clip originally. Frame rate, make sure you match it to what your clip is using, so mine's 60. Progressive and square pixels. I'm going to enable render at maximum depth and maximum render quality, and going to use frame sampling because I haven't done any form of time remapping or speed ramping. You do get to preserve audio doing it this way, so make sure that you have the correct audio settings depending on your clip. This is fine for me, and I'm going to export it quickly. If I show you when we drag it into Premiere Pro, I put it above our original clip, and we'll zoom in 400% so that we can really see the quality difference. We're currently viewing the AVI file, which if I hide that, you'll see there is literally zero difference between the original and the AVI version. However, if we hide the AVI version and drag on our version that's been compressed quite a few times, and if we unhide the version that's been exported a few times, you'll see this is the quality difference. So if we look at the wall over here, look at these tiles, for example, this is the one that's been exported a few times, this is the AVI, and this is the original clip. There is no difference between the AVI and the original version. So if we compare this as original against the exported one, very, very different when it comes to quality. This was exported using H.264. So if you can, use dynamic link. If not, export using a lossless or uncompressed video format. Now onto my third tip of the video, and this is one that in the past I've been guilty of as well. And this is making edits at 60 FPS. Now that might sound obvious to a lot of you, but that, depending on your project, could be a big mistake. If you're making sort of highlight montages like CJ and Zishu, that sort of thing, sure, stick with 60 FPS. It'll make your trick shots look smoother. However, if you're going to be making a proper edit, say an over edit with a lot of time remapping and speed ramping, then you're going to want to edit at 24 FPS. Either 24, 25 or 30, around that range. Now the reason for this is both it's going to feel more cinematic, but the biggest thing for me is it'll make time remapping smoother. Now I'll show you what I mean. If I'm editing at 60 FPS and the clip that I'm editing is 60 FPS and I want to slow it down, I'm going to be dropping frames. If you've recorded your clips at higher FPS, say 120, 240, this doesn't apply to you. But let's say I want to slow this down by half speed. And again, this applies to any editing software. So if I just go through my clip frame by frame, you'll see every frame I skip over here, the image changes once, right? If I now right click on my clip, time stretch, and I make it twice as long, now watch what happens. I'm going to skip a frame, nothing's changed. I'm going to skip a frame, now it has changed. Skip a frame, nothing changed. Skip a frame, it has changed. You'll see essentially every other frame is changing, and that's because essentially I'm running the clip at 30 FPS now rather than 60, so I've dropped frames from my 60 FPS composition. In a full 60 FPS edit, this will look choppy. So here I've got my 60 FPS clip at normal speed, and then the clip cuts and it slows down by 2.5 times, so 250% of the length of the original clip is essentially what this means. So I've stretched it to 250% of its original length, meaning that as we scroll through, you'll see we're having loads and loads and loads of duplicate frames. Sometimes it's only 2, sometimes it's 3, and this is going to look choppy, especially when transitioning from one into the other. So if I play this, you'll see that it will become choppy when it slows down. And this will be even more noticeable if we slowed it down even more. There is one thing you can do to combat this, and that's to use a form of frame blending. So if I enable pixel motion frame blending. Now I've enabled pixel motion frame blending on the second part of the clip, you'll see it does go smooth. You see the slow motion, it is now smooth in comparison to what it was before, but you get these awful artifacts. Like when I flick the knife around, over here on the right hand side you see these horrible artifacts. You're going to encounter a lot of that when using this, and that's really the only way to make it smooth at 60 FPS if you're going to slow down clips. I encourage you to check out my video on flow frames, which I mentioned earlier, will also be in the description, where I show you how to turn 60 FPS clips into higher FPS clips to avoid all of this entirely. But if you only have 60 FPS clips, then this is really your only choice. Now what we can do if we want to slow our clips down but maintain every frame as being from the original video rather than these interpolated ones from the frame blending, we can open up our 24 FPS composition. If I show you the composition settings, you can see it is 24 FPS, and if we re-import our clip again and scroll through so that we're at a similar sort of point to we were in the last one, you'll see this is all completely original frames and it's running at the same speed as the 60 FPS clip. Depending on your editing software, you may have to speed up the clip as it may actually run at 24 FPS rather than play at native speed but at 24 FPS. You'll know what I mean if you run into that problem, but essentially my clip's playing at the correct speed. It's just showing me every third frame and I'm dropping the ones in between. So now if I want to slow this clip down, so I'll split it here and I'll time stretch 250% without any frame blending at all. You see there's no frame blending option enabled. Every frame is a new original frame and I'm completely smooth in my slow motion, and I won't be dropping any frames simply because I've lowered the frame rate of the composition that I'm working in. And that is essentially my main reason for making edits at 24 FPS rather than 60. There are plenty of other reasons as well. This tweet by T3C sort of explains it pretty well. But yeah, unless you're making like a frag movie or highlight montage, stick to 24 to 30 FPS. Now to my tip and editing mistake number 4. This is overdoing color corrections and color grading, and also not having accurate color corrections and color grading, and I'll explain to you what I mean. Now, if you're making a montage or edit, I'm assuming it's because you want to post it on social media, whether that be YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, whatever. You're going to want to avoid overdoing the color corrections because it can take away from your edit, as well as making sure it's accurate. And by accurate, what I mean is a lot of us gamers will have gaming monitors which prioritize refresh rate and anti-ghosting and stuff like that, but not necessarily color accuracy. So in order to achieve these high refresh rates, a lot of manufacturers use a TN panel in their monitors, which has significantly worse color accuracy than, say, an IPS panel, for example. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then I'll put on screen a comparison between a photo I've taken of my gaming monitor screen and a photo on my MacBook screen with the same image up to show you the difference in the colors. Now, it may not be that drastic. Depending on your monitor, it could be very different. So I urge you, when you're color correcting, to just save a frame. In After Effects, that's simple. You can go up to composition and you can just save one frame. You don't have to render out the whole edit, and just put it on a USB stick and look at it on something that you know has good color accuracy, whether that be your TV or if you have a phone, disable True Tone or any kind of color enhancing settings, and look at it on there. Just make sure that when you're doing it, you're not just relying on what you can see on your monitor, because once you upload it onto YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, whatever, it's going to be seen on a variety of different devices. And if you're playing with maximum digital vibrance or you have really bad color accuracy, what you're seeing is not going to be representative of what other people will be seeing when they watch it. And the second part of this tip is to not overdo the color grading as well. I know it's very tempting, and I've been guilty of this in the past as well, to just go crazy with the color corrections. You want to make sure they're tasteful and don't take away from the main edit. And another thing is to make sure your color grade is consistent throughout. Again, I've done this before when I was learning editing. It can be quite tempting to stick a different CC onto every clip, but it can be very jarring to watch, as I'm sure you'll want your montage to be one cohesive video the whole way through, rather than having a crazy color grade on every single clip. Something you can do, which is okay, is if you have multiple clips on different maps, for example, having a different color correction for each map to bring them closer together in color profile. Obviously, yes, you will need a different color grade on each clip depending on the different maps, but don't make them drastically different unless obviously that's your intention with your edit, in which case go ham. And also maybe come back at a later date, either the next day or take a break for a few hours, come back and look at it again with a fresh pair of eyes. And I know after staring at the same clips for hours and hours on end while you're editing them, you sort of become desensitized to these sort of things, as well as maybe ask a friend, whether it be in person or over Discord, just to have a look at it and get their opinion on it. Color corrections can be a great tool, but if they're done properly, they shouldn't be noticeable. And finally, on to tip number 5, which I think is possibly one of the most important ones, and that is avoiding repetition in your montage. Now, this applies to everything, whether it be visual effects, sound effects, transitions. Try to have some variety in your edit. I see loads of edits that look like this, where it's simply the same effect, where you've got a brightness adjustment, a scale, and a blur, the exact same on every single clip. As well as they probably use the same whoosh sound effect. Try to add some kind of variety. So for example, on this clip, I have brightness and contrast. Let's get rid of that. Let's add exposure instead. We'll take the exposure up by 2, keyframe that back to 0. Then on our next clip, how about we get rid of the zoom entirely and instead we add a shake. Now, with these kind of effects, it's even better because you get a seed variable. And what this does is it means you can essentially use the same effect over and over again, but change the seed each time, and the effect is going to look different. So if you are going to be repeating effects, maybe use ones like this, where I could copy and paste this exact same keyframes on the shake effect 3 or 4 different times with a different seed each time, and they will look different. And then maybe on this last clip, instead of zooming in when we get the kill, let's have it zoom out. So I'll extend the adjustment layer, we'll take our scale keyframe back a bit, and then we'll bring our other scale keyframe forwards. And you'll see here instead it zooms in and then pops back out when you get the kill instead, just to add some sort of variety. The exact same thing applies when you're using transitions like swish pan, for example. The amount of montages I see with the same transition between every single effect, just like this. Use it, but maybe switch it to be up instead. And you'll see here now the transition between the clips goes up, or just use an entirely different transition altogether, or don't use a transition at all. It really depends on your edit. And now, of course, you can use the same effects multiple times in an edit, but try not to use them back to back or they'll get really repetitive. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please slap a like on it. Leave a comment suggesting any videos that you'd like to see in the future, as well as give you some feedback on this one. Subscribe for more videos just like this. Check out my Patreon with the link down in the description, where you can get early access and exclusive content, as well as access to all my project files for both my edits and tutorials. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.